On today's video, the truth about illegal immigration into the United States in the year 2024. All over social media, you see people saying things like, "The borders wide open." We recently took a survey on our YouTube channel, and 70% of our audience believes that illegal or undocumented workers hurt the U.S. economy, while only 30% believe they help. So without a doubt, the overwhelming sentiment in the United States is against undocumented entry. Furthermore, ignorant individuals have stopped using terms like undocumented and illegal and are just now using the word migrant as if every single migrant was illegal. That's a fairly disrespectful stance. It's suggesting to people who are U.S. citizens but migrated to the United States that they're no different than those who are illegal. And really, at the end of the day, the sentiment in the United States about illegal immigration or undocumented entry come from a place of hate. It doesn't come from a place of logic. It doesn't come from a place of understanding. It doesn't even come from a place of economical value that these people bring. It comes from a place of hate. Clearly, the recent change in vocabulary, distinguishing undocumented from documented or legal from illegal, and just referring to anybody who is illegal as a migrant is fairly offensive. So the vast majority of people understand that it's not beneficial to have undocumented people entering the country. That's a logical conclusion. That's not what today's video is about. Today's video, we're going to understand that the sentiment of hate is the place where many of the misunderstandings and misinformation about this topic are coming from. For example, I value the fact that somebody is an entrepreneur. They made a voyage across many countries to make their lives better and to take care of their families. I don't hate the individual that's coming to the United States as a person. I just wish that they came through a legal avenue. However, that is not the way the vast majority of people think or actually feel about the subject. The way people actually feel about this subject, that's not what we're talking about. People hate the person. They hate the nationality. They hate the clothing. They hate the culture. They hate the human being. So we have to make a distinguishing factor between understanding that undocumented entry into the country is not beneficial. You can have that understanding and not have a sentiment of hate towards people. Unfortunately today, the sentiment of hating these individuals is the leading factor behind the information that's being pushed. And really, the mindset that people have about illegal immigration is somewhat distorted because it's not coming from a place of understanding, it's coming from a place of hate. And we don't have to argue that. On today's video, we're going to show you real information so you can understand exactly where drugs are coming from, who is coming to the United States illegally, why they're coming to the United States illegally. We're going to understand all these factors, and once we understand the real facts about this situation, then we'll be more easily able to understand whether the sentiment's coming from a place of understanding or if it's coming from a place of hate. Of course, a vast majority of people who are blabbering on about illegal immigration are doing it from a place of hate. If you're in a place of understanding, then you wouldn't be concerned about the polar prices. You would be understanding that the real problem is somewhere else. All right, but we're not going to cater our video to arguing with morons. Let's get to the real facts. So on the media, we hear a lot about how California and other Democrat states are welcoming in illegals. The state of California has 160,000 notices to appear. When you enter the United States illegally, you turn yourself in to Border Patrol and they give you a notice to appear, which means you're going to go in front of a judge and have the opportunity to see if your entry was legitimate or if you're going to be denied the opportunity to have legal status. In the past, the percentage of illegal migrants crossing in the United States was larger. However, because now they're looking for a notice to appear, in other words, people who enter the United States now are hoping that they can get legal status in the United States. In the past, people came here to work and then go back to their countries. They had no interest to ever become U.S. citizens. But now, the overwhelming majority of people entering the United States are individuals who have the intent to seek legal asylum. In other words, people coming to the United States now more than ever are seeking a legal avenue. The number at the borders are at all-time record numbers. Yes, that is because today when people come to the United States, they're not looking to work for 5 or 6 years and then return home. They're looking for a notice to appear in front of a judge. You're able to count these people now because they're seeking legal status. And since other legal avenues that existed to entering the United States legally, like for example, Cubans had the wet foot, dry foot law, now that that law doesn't exist, it's a more logical option for people to turn themselves in for a notice to appear versus an avenue that no longer exists. So because more people are seeking the legal avenue, more people are being counted by US officials. In the past, when people were entering the United States freely and going back and forth as they pleased, you couldn't count them. But Jose, California has 160,000 illegal immigrants coming in 2023. The state of Florida had 150,000. But here's the problem with that figure. California's population is almost twice Florida's population. Despite California having almost 2 times more people, they have roughly about the same number of people waiting for a court hearing. In other words, the notion of pointing a finger at California and saying, look at them, they're harboring illegal immigrants, or they're harboring people with a notice to appear, which are probably about 80% of the people coming into the United States. There's no real way to really gather a number on that, but if you talk to people in the community like I do, you're going to find out that about 80% have a notice to appear, while only about 20% are actually illegally in the country. Today, about 80% of the people entering the United States are going to go for the notice to appear. It doesn't really make sense to go without it because if they get caught, then they'll never have the opportunity to have a legal avenue. Now, here's an interesting fact. Only 273 people turn themselves in voluntarily to customs in Puerto Rico. Now, that's a very interesting figure because in Puerto Rico, you speak Spanish, which is the language of Latin America. You would think this is where immigrants would want to go. Beyond that, there's a massive population of people from Latin America in Puerto Rico, which would suggest that Puerto Rico should, in theory, have a very large percentage of people, not a significantly lower percentage of people, but you never hear anything mentioned about Puerto Rico's illegal immigrant problem. It just isn't relevant. So obviously the problem that's most obvious when you go over real analytics is the fact that less than 300 people entered Puerto Rico and asked for a notice to appear in front of a judge, when Puerto Rico, being a U.S. territory in the Caribbean islands, next to all the nations that people are fleeing, like Haiti, Dominican Republic, and Venezuela, would be a logical landing point for a lot of illegals. Puerto Rico is filled with immigrant communities, yet in Puerto Rico, apparently nobody has the intention to appear in front of a judge. But of course, that doesn't make mainstream media because, again, mainstream media isn't catering to real facts, real analytics on illegal immigration. They're catering to the sentiment of hate of their audience. Now, of course, you've heard on the media the attacks on New York City. New York City's full of immigrants. They're busing immigrants by the busload. We've heard all that crap about New York. You'd be surprised to know that the state of New York actually has less notices of appearing than the state of Florida, which goes to show that we're not really painting an accurate picture on the media side of what's actually happened with the immigration crisis. They're again catering to their hate-filled audience. When you start to follow the real numbers and the real analytics on illegal immigration, the narrative that the media paints catering to their hate-filled sentiment audience doesn't check out because the numbers simply do not paint the picture that they're trying to portray. Some years back, cities like New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco were actually able to reduce their illegal immigrant populations. Of course, you never actually heard that in the media. Meanwhile, cities like Charlotte, North Carolina, and Atlanta, Georgia actually had an increase of illegal immigrants. They're trying to paint it as New York City and San Francisco are having a surge of illegal immigrants. However, in reality, when you look at the real numbers, the states and regions that are having the most influx of people who are undocumented or waiting for a notice to appear are places like the following: Georgia, 37,000. Indiana, 18,000. Massachusetts, nearly 38,000. Minnesota, 14,000. New Jersey, 61,000. North Carolina, 28,000. Ohio, 21,000. Tennessee, 25,000. To give you a comparison, the state of New Mexico, right on the border, had just over 3,000. Now in 2023, there really has been an explosion of people seeking those notices to appear. Most people who enter the United States from the southwest border are going to flee from the border as soon as they can. They don't want to be in that border region because there really is a lot of security along the border. Now, I've been along the border from the eastern tip of Texas all the way to San Diego, California. In other words, I have actually driven the border from one end to the other. If you think there isn't security at the border, you simply haven't been to the U.S.-Mexico border. You could be 100 miles from the border and there's still an incredible government presence. It's not even logical for there to be that much presence along the border. So those people who think that the border is unprotected, you simply have not been anywhere near the U.S.-Mexico border. If you actually went there, you would be surprised how much security is in place in this region. It's absolutely incredible. A lot of these people who are repeating that the border is out of control and that there isn't enough security in the border are people who have probably never driven more than 200 miles away from their home state. If you take that voyage like I did along the U.S.-Mexico border from Texas to California, you'll understand exactly how much security there is in place in this region. When you look at countries like Cuba and Venezuela, the United States is part of the reason that these people are fleeing their countries, to the point that the United States allowed Cubans just to enter the United States and have legal access to becoming a citizen simply by touching foot on U.S. ground. The reason the United States extended this privilege, we could call it, to the Cubans was because the United States was kind of part of the reason why Cubans were coming here to begin with. The same thing can be said about Venezuelans. Venezuelans, they were living in the richest Latin American country. The United States became involved and interested in their oil affairs and thus agitated the situation in Venezuela. Thus, the instability that the country now faces is somewhat interlinked with U.S. policy. In other words, you cannot really blame Cubans and Venezuelans for coming to the United States when the United States is the main or a massive portion of the instability that these countries are seeing are because of U.S. policies. So much so that these immigrants are allowed privileges like being able to become U.S. citizens because the United States understands that they're complicit in the situation in one way or another. Right at the footsteps of the United States, the country of Cuba and Haiti, people are literally starving. Yet, despite you being able to ride a raft of styrofoam from Haiti and Cuba and reach the United States, that's how close these countries are, nothing has ever been done to help these countries have independence or a good system. But the United States gets involved in wars halfway around the world every other year to create instability in oil-rich regions of the world, while places like Haiti and Cuba that are right at the footsteps at the United States, basically, these countries receive no help because really there's no monetary interest in creating instability or getting involved in these countries, despite the fact that millions of Haitians and Cubans have had to flee their country with aspirations to enter the United States legally or illegally. In Obama's last day in office, he got rid of the wet foot, dry foot law, which allowed Cubans to have legal status simply by arriving in the United States. In other words, both Republican and Democrat policies have worked together to ensure that the crisis continues to grow, all the while, on the face value side of it, proclaiming that they're doing something about the issue. But this is all face value with the simple intention of telling people what they want to hear, but not actually doing anything about the problem. Why? Well, the US government knows intricately all of the facets of illegal immigration in a way that the US people don't. The US people hear what they want to hear and are told exactly that. But the US government actually understands the bigger picture of illegal immigration, and it's one clear fact that the United States economy and its global importance depends solely on all of the large cities in the United States, all of the industries like construction, everything that has to do with growth and commerce depends largely on trade and immigrants. Thus, the United States cannot go without the influx of people from other countries, but they want to make sure that they can hold these people back. So while the United States can exploit these people and their productivity, that the people themselves are not able to enjoy the benefit of the country they are creating. It's not really a secret that all of the places that have the lowest percentage of immigrants, places like Maine, places like West Virginia, Mississippi, Alabama, those places are literally the most miserable, starving places in the country. And all the largest hubs of commerce, Chicago, New York, LA, are vastly immigrant communities. With the exception of Chicago, these cities usually have lower murder rates, lower crime rates, better safety analytics, better income analytics, lower percentages of drug overdoses. There's not a single metric of health, income, safety, or anything that's beneficial that you can point a finger to West Virginia, Mississippi, Alabama, and Maine and say they are doing something good that the rest of the country needs to imitate. In other words, the places that don't have large immigrant populations are places that the average American would despise having to live in. I've looked at hundreds of metrics for crime, safety, health, anything you could think of, and in every single category, these states that have the lowest percentages of immigrants are the absolute worst at everything. Take the safest cities in the United States by murder rate. They all happen to be large immigrant communities or right along the US-Mexico border. Chula Vista in California, less than 1 per 100,000. El Paso, Texas, about 3 per 100,000. Brownsville, Texas. Miami, Florida. Let's take a look at Hialeah, which is like 95% Hispanic, has one of the lowest murder rates. So on one extreme of crime and safety, all of the cities that have large immigrant populations also happen to have the best safety analytics. On the other end, when you look at large US cities that have the lowest percentages of immigrant populations, you're going to find the worst US cities. Jackson, Mississippi, Birmingham, Alabama, Memphis, Tennessee. If you've been watching my channel for a long time, you know these analytics, what I'm talking about, because we've gone over it many times on our channel. Quite literally, analytically, there's no way you could prove that immigrants are harmful to the United States. In fact, after large sprouts of deportations, we've seen large increases in overdose death rates and homicide rates. In other words, the tighter you choke the immigration chicken, the rougher things get in the United States with more homicides, more overdose deaths. It seems like this is a topic that the more involvement you have with it, the worse things get. So in general, the American public has a sense of hate and resentment towards immigrant communities and illegals in particular. However, you cannot analytically prove that they're bad for the country. If you were going to analytically try to make a point that immigrants hurt the United States, it would be difficult to find analytics to collaborate these facts, because the vast majority, if not all of the analytics, point that when an area has a larger variety of immigrants, it's heading in the right direction. People move to places that are growing and prospering with the intentions to grow and prosper. People don't move to places that are dying. Now, one of the core issues that the United States has with immigration is that the United States attracts poor, hungry, uneducated people from countries that are having a lot of conflicts, poverties, and issues, versus a country like Canada that attracts the right type of immigrants. Why that would not work in the United States is because Americans could not stand the notion of watching an immigrant like an Asian or an Arab coming to the United States, prospering and living a better quality of life than the US citizen that's native. In other words, Americans cannot stand the notion of somebody else living better than them. So while in Canada, they've attracted the right type of immigrants, very wealthy immigrants, the United States cannot do that because the United States notion of immigrants is poor, starving people that are uneducated because perhaps the American is not as competitive in the labor force. Like when you look at Canada, the business owners are from other countries and the native Canadians just simply don't have the same income, don't have the same attainment to education. For the most part in Canada, the Canadian native is the poor person. Americans couldn't stand the notion of attracting wealthy people from other countries because their pride and ego wouldn't allow them. But what has this done for Canada? Canada's murder rates are about a quarter of the United States. In other words, despite Canada having an incredible influx of immigrants, they have the only large city in North America that is on par with European cities by murder rate. That being Toronto, Canada, one of the most diverse cities in the entire world, has murder rate analytics on par with European cities. The safest large city in the United States would be the most dangerous large city in Europe. So clearly it's undisputable when you look at a country like Canada right next door to the United States in a large city like Toronto, the great benefits that immigration can have on a country. The problem is that Americans wouldn't want to see, for example, a city like Miami built by immigrants that's very successful and overshadows economically. So yes, when you see a city like Toronto, lowest murder rates in North America, incredible economy, a clean, fast-growing city predominantly built by immigrants, it's really undeniable analytically that the effect of immigration is a positive one. So if you're an American and you just don't want to see illegal immigrants, understandable. We can see clearly analytically by the polls we take that the sentiment in the United States is against illegal immigrants or even immigrants in general. That's fine. We understand the sentiment, but don't sit here and try to tell me that it's hurting the U.S. economy, that they're taking jobs, that they're destroying the country, because that might be your perspective. That may be the way you would want to see things, but it's not really analytical. For example, I like eating pizza. It's not healthy for you. You shouldn't be doing it, but I like it. I like eating spaghetti and pasta and lasagna. It's not healthy for me. It's not good for me. Could I try to tell myself that it's not going to hurt me if I eat a pizza? Absolutely. I could make up all types of excuses and explanations about why I like these foods, but I couldn't really prove it to you that it's good for me. Another great example. Oh man, it relaxes me, bro. It makes me calm down, bro. Yeah, you can tell yourself whatever you want about that habit, and you can try to tell yourself it's medical, it's healthy, it's been proven to be good, and you can try to tell me whatever argument you want. Doesn't change the facts. The facts cannot be changed by your perspective. The problem starts when you try to manipulate the analytics and the facts to try to back up your side of the argument. Now, finally, many immigrants are choosing to stay in Mexico rather than the United States. It is believed that somewhere between 15 to 30 million Mexicans lived in the United States before 2016, when the U.S. sentiment against immigrants, particularly Mexicans, became fairly harsh. At which point, many Mexicans that were living in the United States decided to go back to their countries, not by deportation, but voluntarily. And Mexico's economy has been growing tremendously to the point where Mexico's economy now, there's a handful of states in Mexico that have higher incomes than the United States. In other words, if you look at Mexico's best states, their homicide rates and incomes are better than the worst states in the United States. In other words, if you had to live in Mississippi for the rest of your life or Campeche, Mexico, most people, after looking and studying these places, would decide with going with the Mexican state and not the American state. Recently, people in Central America were surveyed and told if they were able to move to the United States but had to live in Birmingham, St. Louis, or Detroit, or they would stay in their home country, the overwhelming majority said that they would think moving to those cities would be too scary and dangerous, and they would stay in their home country, which is one of the most dangerous regions in the world to begin with. Of course, when you look at the country of Mexico, insecurity continues to be a threat in that country, and that really is the drawback to Mexico, is safety. If Mexico were to somehow able to correct their crime, their economy isn't really the problem at this point. In fact, a lot of Americans would at this point move to Mexico except for the safety predicament that that country is in right now. People fleeing the Dominican Republic, Haiti, and other countries that already have a crime concern are deciding to move to Mexico because it's a more welcoming country, not only from a legal status, but socially Mexicans are more welcoming than Americans, and thus you're starting to see a lot of immigrant communities growing within the country of Mexico. You now have Dominicans, Haitians, Cubans, and other nationalities that would have normally gone to the United States. And now Mexico is having thriving immigrant communities that the Mexican people are starting to realize are willing to work for less. Basically, everything that was happening in the United States, if we were to backtrack to maybe 2007, is happening in Mexico, where Mexicans are starting to realize, hey, these people are willing to work for less, they're willing to work harder, they have a better work ethic. Basically, for a lot of immigrants, Mexico is becoming the new United States, with, of course, a higher crime rate index, as if the United States wasn't getting out of control with crime lately. Cubans are literally starving. Haiti has been taken over by gangs, and in Venezuela, oppression is a huge concern. As long as there is instability in Latin America, there will be immigrants trying to enter the United States. Finally, fentanyl has killed over 100,000 Americans every single year, and many people blame the situation at the US-Mexico border as the entry point for the drugs that are killing Americans at record numbers. If you were to start to look at the arrests that are coming out of the state of Florida, you'll start to notice that many of the people being arrested for illegal trafficking amounts are not of Mexican descent. Whether it's Miami, Orlando, Hernando, Polk, Orlando area, a lot of the most recent arrests in Florida for trafficking amounts are coming from Puerto Rico, not the Mexico border. They don't really report this information anymore, but many years ago, 80% of everything coming illegally into the United States was not coming to the US-Mexico border. It had shifted from a new route in the Caribbean islands, from Venezuela to Trinidad to Puerto Rico, and then spreading in through the West Indies into the United States. That was the most recent entry route into the United States. But now with this fascination that people have with the border, they've stopped publishing these percentages of where these routes are right now. But as of the most recent source that we had, most of the entry points were not the US-Mexico border. They were the Caribbean islands, with the entrance of Venezuelan, Trinidadian, Puerto Rican, and Dominican cartels. There are 45 different entities, states, or governments or nations in the Caribbean islands. 45 different places through the Caribbean Ocean that can be used as routes into the United States. However, the entire fascination of the US media is with the US-Mexican border. The stupidity of Americans to be fascinated with a hatred towards illegal immigrants when they don't even understand who these people are, where they're coming from, and the same thing could be about the drugs. Of course, the demand is in the United States. Whether it comes from Venezuela and the Caribbean islands, or it comes through Mexico, or it comes through Canada, the demand is still American. So you don't need to be mad at the border because your family members are dropping dead and right because of drug overdoses. You need to be mad at your family members for going to drugs. Because while the American white population is dying at incredible rates from drug overdoses, the African American community isn't suffering this fate. The Hispanic communities in the United States are not suffering this fate. You are the one who's bringing that to yourself. You can't blame the border for your addiction problem. Do you know that these addicts, when they don't have access to pill bottles with pills and whatever the crap they do you know they actually use rat poison, cockroach poison? And I recently bought a bottle of duster to clean off my keyboard. People actually inhale those substances. You watch my homeless camp videos, these people will get high on anything. I've seen homeless people get high on spray paint cans, duster for your keyboard, rat poison. They'll spray cockroach poison on a piece of paper and smoke it. These people will get high on anything that will literally kill them 10 times faster than the things that are coming across the border. However, if you actually sat down and studied how these things are coming into the United States, how many Americans work for FedEx, UPS, and other transportation hubs? The millions of people that visit the United States every single year, they'll bring a small amount in their luggage or their clothing, transportation. If you actually break down all the ways that things get into the United States, you'll start to realize that today, especially with more security at the border, you're starting to see more small networks bringing everything in. Yes, there was a time when the Mexico border had less security. Today, there's a lot of small networks. Dominican, Colombian, Caribbean islands. They're using airplanes. They're using people traveling. They're using somebody who works in transportation. There's so many small networks. The pipeline is still the same big pipeline, but it's just broken down through different methods of entry. And the point of entry is not always the US-Mexico border. I don't know if you guys know this, but one of the most secure ways to bring a load into the United States is something called a parasite. Basically, this thing attaches itself to the bottom of a boat, and it might have maybe 100 bricks. That has a GPS tracker in it. If the United States Coast Guard were to approach a boat that has a load, they can drop the parasite and pick it up at another point. They're also timeline biodegradable, so they can have an idea of when the materials are going to break down and know how much time they have to go pick it up again. In other words, there's actually methods of bringing in 100 or 200 bricks that are completely safe for the person transporting it. They can release it at any time, and the person who owns it can recover it at any time without having to worry about arrest or getting confiscated a large volume of products. Parasites are literally undetectable. There's no risk of the person transporting getting caught, and there's not even a worry about losing the product. In fact, many times they'll attach a parasite to a boat heading in a particular direction, and the people who are navigating the boat are not even aware that there's a parasite attached. They have a GPS tracker on it, and then they release it in a specific spot like low water where they can retrieve it, which means that many times the boats that are transporting these parasites are not even aware that they're being used for that purpose. It's a secure way for them to get this stuff through the Caribbean islands into the United States without having to worry. Of course, you've seen on the news what they do in Colombia, where somebody's traveling to the United States, they eat the packets, it's in their stomach. That's today's video. A lot of times Americans are sentimental about things they really don't even understand. The media feeds them what they want to hear because that's what they want, and they give it to them. But in reality, if you really start to dive into the analytics, the numbers, how things actually work, you'll realize that this complicated issue is mostly just, as typical in the United States, misleading media information. Really, what's destroying the United States is not the import, it's the addiction. Really, the issue with immigration isn't that people are coming here and taking jobs, it's that there's international instability. But of course, you're addressing the symptoms, not the actual problem. People buy it up, swallow it up, and they really don't understand these issues. But despite not understanding them, they're very sentimental about it. And while there's no real analytical information to prove it, just by talking to people and living here in South Florida, you should know that U.S. American natives at this point in history have the largest percentage of involvement in the illegal trafficking world than ever. Never have U.S. citizens been as involved in trafficking as they are right now. So even if you got out of all the exterior elements, there's still a huge amount of U.S. citizens who take on small endeavors to visit these countries and bring back whatever they can by whatever ingenious methods they have. And many times those people go completely undetected because they're not the target. So this is so much more complicated than we would ever have time to elaborate on today's video. But yes, a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of misinformation, and unfortunately, since it's coming from a place of hate, completely not based on logic.